Hello, guess what? It's week number 8. Well, it's 2 days of week number 8, and that means this is the last Watch Me. I know y'all are crying. Um, anyway, I'm going to do the usual. I'll do a little housekeeping, then we'll talk about the 3 chapters, which are short. And that will hopefully help you finish the test. If you haven't, these were short chapters. They were about the gender and muted groups theory. I think probably most of y'all are ahead of the game. Some of you all are done, I noticed, which is good. I need to say up front, I'm still behind with the grading. I will get there. I know that's frustrating for you, but it's probably twice as frustrating for me. You have to remember that you write one paper. I have to grade 32 papers and 32 tests. So it takes some time because, as you can tell, I put quite a bit of time into the grading. With the last article analysis, I will read it for what's supposed to be there, and not do any markings on it, and then post that for you. Then, sorry, if you want me to, I will go back and do the grammatical marking and make those things. And that's hard for me because when I'm reading and I see it, all right. So what I probably will do is I'll circle things and then I'll go back and fix that if you want to. I need to get caught up. I'm still behind on the forum posts. And because of that, when I finish, if you are not happy with your grade and you have not turned in an extra credit article analysis, which the offer is still there, I will allow you to turn that in as soon as I finish the grade. So we won't say that those are due Wednesday by midnight like the rest of them are due. All right, we'll say that if you need those extra credit points, when I finish with the grading, then you'll be able to turn that into me. So if that doesn't make sense, just email me. All right. A lot of y'all are sitting on an A. So you're not, if I'm going to say it again, if you're sitting on an A, don't do the extra credit. Anyway, so hopefully that makes sense. The last test I put up on Thursday. It's not due until tomorrow night, Tuesday night. And it is just 10 questions, and hopefully you will, and one of those is a giveaway. It'll be very similar to tomorrow's forum post. So you can, you probably just copy and paste and add a little bit more discussion to the test question and you'll be good to go. Anyway, the biggest thing, and I'll do this at the end. Let's go ahead and talk about the chapters and then I'll say so long. I'll miss you all. You guys have been a great class. The 3 chapters are chapters 34 to 36. Chapter 37 really is there too, but if you have looked at that, you'll have noticed that that is not really a chapter of substance, except that it explains everything that we have talked about, all the theories we've talked about and how they work together, how they cross over each other and those kinds of things. So, I didn't open the book. Let me get to the first section here. This section, the last 3 chapters are about gender communication and how the different genders communicate differently. Let me make note again that men and women interact differently, like you didn't know that, right? We do make a difference we do distinguish between gender and sex. Sex is biological, male, female, right? And gender is anthropological, psychological, sociological, and that's on a continuum. Masculine at one end, feminine at the other, in the middle, androgyny. All right, and so you can be female and be masculine, all right, and you can be male and be feminine, or you can be in the middle, which I happen to be, all right? So I have some things that I do that are very feminine. I have some things that I do that are very masculine. And so those are things that I want you to pay attention to. The chapter 34 is actually one of the most commonly studied gender communication theories, and that's genderlect. It's kind of like dialect, but genderlect. Okay, that's where it comes from. And Deborah Tannen is the most cited theorist in the field of gender communication. She actually has some pop books out there, not just research books, although she is a psychologist. Her field is not communication, but the field of communication adopted her material early on. And then one of the ones that we'll talk about here in a second is Julie Wood, and she is a communication professor. But anyway, Deborah Tannen's theory deals with the idea that there are feminine styles of discourse and there are masculine styles of discourse. And, there are issues about, because we talk about the feminine gender, is more likely to seek connection, and and men's dialect is more likely to seek status when talking. If you go back to the interpersonal chapters that we talked about 8 weeks ago, a long time ago, we talked about some of that then. Tannen said, and I don't know that this is so much true anymore because Tannen's material is fairly old, 20 years by today's standards in the study of how men and women communicate differently. But Tannen would say that men are mainly concerned with status when they talk, and that women look more for connection with the people that they're talking about. And women are more concerned about whether or not their peers like them and stuff. So those were, what's research said. You can find some research that backs that up, but we're seeing more and more where parents are bringing up their male and female children to have more gender characteristics that cross over each other. Women, it's more acceptable for women to be more androgynous than men to be androgynous, because women are not judged as harshly if they have, by society, if they have some masculine characteristics, because we are a masculine society, which we talked about in the earlier chapters here. And so that if women have some masculine characteristics, especially in today's society, if a woman wants to get ahead, she has to have some of the masculine characteristics, like be more competitive, be more assertive, which are more masculine characteristics. So, one of the areas that Tannen was well known for was the idea of rapport talk versus report talk. Rapport, R-A-P-P-O-R-T, meaning connection, all right? And report, this is how it is. I'm reporting how it is. More feminine style is rapport, all right? More masculine style is report, all right? And that's where I pick up some of my more masculine characteristics. I have a tendency to be more reporting sometimes than trying to build rapport. Anyway, so you'll see a good story, a good description of that in the textbook and in the PowerPoint. Another area where we see some gender differences in genderlect is telling a story. When a man tells a story and when a woman tells a story, or when a more masculine person tells a story and a more feminine person tells a story, it's going to be different, all right? The more feminine style is to give more details. And that's one area where I have some feminine characteristics in my communication. Like, I got to give you every single little detail. So humor in stories is different from masculine approach or a feminine approach. Listening is another area where we have some gender differences, and women will back channel more. And back channeling means, when someone's talking, women are going to nod their head. Right, and men use less back channeling. So interruptions, I asked this in my nonverbal class last week, who interrupts more? It's a trick question, right? Because men and women interrupt about equally, according to research, but they interrupt for different reasons. Men often, and remember, these are generalizations, they're not 100% true, will interrupt to take over the conversation, all right? And women will interrupt to build on the conversation, to interject or to ask questions. So, and asking questions is another masculine feminine area that we look at about how people ask questions. Women have a tendency to ask more tag questions, which are short questions at the end of what they're saying. So if I say, well, I did this, 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 and this, do you like that? All right, ask you a tag question to get you to speak and often to affirm what I have said. Conflict, probably no surprise to you, especially those of you with significant others that you might have the conflict. Go back to the chapter on conversational dialectics that we talked about early on in the interpersonal chapters. Men and women conflict differently, right? And motives are different. And then, of course, nonverbal communication is different. And that's a no-brainer. All right, more masculine behaviors, more feminine behaviors. And where did you learn those? Well, probably growing up. All right, and those of you with children have probably brought your children up learning some of the exact same things that you learned. So hopefully this will make sense to you that we've seen this. We're going to look at two more little short ones that have some of the same issues that come into play there too. And that you, as the textbook says, now you're beginning to understand we communicate differently. And the ethical reflection on this is that a different theorist, Gilligan, came along and said that it wasn't right that we should generalize, all right? Because when we generalize, then what we do is we stereotype and that we cause people to think that that's the way it is when it might not be the way it is. But you all are smart people. I know that 8 weeks into the class. Don't let that become your, oh, well, Dr. Moore said that this is, it's like, no, you got to get to know the people. So the critique is that this may be an aha factor for some people, but most of y'all are like, well, that's a no-brainer. Right. And by the way, I meant to mention that earlier about the article analyses. Some of you all, your critique of the article is that it's a no-brainer. Okay. I probably shouldn't have used that with you all before because that may be where you're picking that up. But the whole reason, even if it's a no-brainer, that people do it, all right, they run that study that you've been reading about in these article analyses, all right, they run that study to add strength to the theory. So if one person does it and they come up with it, somebody else is going to try it. It's called replication. You'll hear about that again when you're in research methods coming up next semester. All right. I think it's next semester. Maybe it's the other group that has it next semester. But you're going to hear that. You repeat it. And it may be a no-brainer, but every time it's repeated in a different context or a different situation, all right, it adds to it. A lot of you all have written and complained about, well, the sample size is too small. Well, yeah, right, because you can't have generalizability out of one of them. And that's why they run it again also, right? And you'll hear a whole lot more about that aspect of these things you've been studying. All these theories you've been studying in here will have a number of articles written about experiments that people did and studies that people did to discover what's going on. So anyway, back to tannin. Yes, it seems to be a little bit overgeneralized and a no-brainer, right? But it adds strength to the idea that men and women do communicate differently, all right? That's where that leads to. So anyway, that's chapter 34. Chapter 35 is called the standpoint theory, and it's the theory of Sandra Harding and Julia Wood. I don't know Sandra Harding, but Julia Wood is a good friend. She has a book out called Gendered Lives, and we've used that with the gender communication class here a number of times. Standpoint theory is simple. It says, from this place, this standpoint, this is how I view the world. Textbook definition is a place from which to critically view the world around us. All right, and so basically what standpoint is a synonym for viewpoint, perspective, outlook, position. All right, so standpoint theory says this is my standpoint about how the genders communicate differently. Julia Wood is probably the premier gender communication scholar in our field. She's a friend. She was a professor at Chapel Hill before she retired, and so I kind of like her theory, of course, because she's a friend. The idea of the standpoint that Harding and Wood would tell you to look at is that a woman's place is often seen as on the margin of society, from the outside looking in. And so that's what they looked at it about. In the next chapter with the muted group will lead out of this. So you're going to see that the standpoint theory rears its head in just about every major philosophy: Marxism, racism, religionism. All right, so that from my standpoint, this is how I see this. All right, and so because I'm female, I will see it differently than those of you who are male. All right, and the bottom line is that Harding and Wood would say that women in the past have been a marginalized group. And that marginalized group, it's a standpoint, all right, that women are marginalized. And so one of the things that comes out of that is like women are seen as being interdependent and men are seen as being independent, right? So that women count on other people and men don't. Right, now that's a big one that's changing. Hang on. Sorry, I'm not positive where I left off. I know I was talking about women as a marginalized group. Good to point out, not all women share the same standpoint. And of course, you all know that. But make sure that you keep that in mind. The other thing that Harding and Wood talk about is the knowledge from nowhere versus local knowledge, meaning where do we learn these things? Because each social group learns it differently. I would argue with that says each family learns it differently, so that you learn these things about how women are treated and how men are treated. Because we talk about gender communication, people automatically begin to think about women, and it's not just women, men as well. I do want to point out, you'll see some discussion about feminist standpoint. Harding and Wood especially, defines feminism as equal treatment of all people. All right, not just women. It's not just about women. If you believe that everybody should be treated equally in this world, all right, and including both sexes, all right, and including all genders, then you are a feminist. All right, and that's the point that they one of the points that they make, and that Julia Wood has always made. So true feminist is someone who agrees that everybody should be treated fairly and equally. And some people would argue that, but just so you know, that is what they're referring to, not what unfortunately some of the media has done, like calling things like feminazi and that kind of thing. So keep that in mind, that's not what feminism really is about. It's what media from our earlier chapters have turned that term feminism into. So anyway, off my soapbox. Another thing that Harding and Wood talk about is being objective, strong objectivity. They talk about so that you look at research from all standpoints, and you look at research about both men and women, and you become an objective observer of those things. We still find things that when we talk about the differences in genders and sexes, that Julia Wood did a whole bunch of research about caregiving in the United States. We are seeing more and more families where my nephew is the caregiver of their children, and his wife is working on her PhD. But we see a lot more where the male is taking the role of caregiving. And more men that stay home and raise the children. So we are seeing more and more of that. But in the past, historically, women were seen as the caregivers in the family. There is a good discussion about the standpoint of Black feminist thought. And African American women had always felt marginalized by race. So their standpoint about being woman was a whole lot different than Caucasian women. They're just starting to do more research about Latinx and women and those kinds of populations that feel like they're put on the margin of society. So, and you'll read about that. You can talk about how people take care of other people. And there's a good discussion about Collins, who's another theorist who's done a lot of research in Black feminism, and how Black women validate knowledge about themselves and about the sex and gender issues. So you'll want to make sure you read that. The critique of this is it's pretty outdated. All right, because times have changed. So there needs to be more recent research on this, but a lot of people won't do it because they're thinking, well, we've gotten these things, and by the way, when you read it, I'm not positive if they mention it, bras were never burned. It was a term that someone picked up. It's like, so you might want to research that. Nobody burned any bras. Right, but the Women's Lib movement brought about some of the changes and recognition of it. The critique of this one is a good one to look at, folks. Is does the standpoint that you look at this from about being on the margin, being marginalized, give you a false view of what's really going on? So it's something you're going to want to make sure that you read the critique of this. It's funny because this is one of in the critique. This is one of the theories that Griffin et al. All right, because a lot of them they don't like, as you can tell when you read the critiques. So the last chapter that has theory in it is chapter 36, and that's the muted group theory. That's what today's forum post is about. These are groups that have no voice, right? And the first one, that Kramer is the person's whose theory this is, Sheris Kramer. And what she says is that women are a muted group, but there are all kinds of groups that are muted. Men are muted in many situations. Now, Kramer would say that men are the gatekeepers of the muting, but I don't necessarily think that's 100% true anymore. What a muted group is that's a low power group who has to change their language, all right, when communicating publicly to fit into society, to get their ideas out there. If they don't, then their ideas are overlooked, all right? And so we have all kinds of muted groups in the United States, and that's very contextual also. For example, students here on campus would say that they are a muted group because they don't have the voice that, say, the professors have. or the administration has. And faculty would say, well, we're a muted group because we don't have the voice that the administrators have. So muted group just means someone who doesn't have a voice. All right, so there's a lot of things in this chapter. You talk about that historically men have been the people that have named things. That's why this comes in this section on gender and communication. That men were had the dominant mode of communication. There's a lot of, and I think you all will recognize some of this, is that Kramer notes that men's control of the dominant mode of expression produced a whole vast number of derogatory gender-specific terms for women's communication, women's talking, and you can read those. There's some that are a little bit crass, so I won't read those out loud, but things like catty, and I always say female canining, so shrill, gossipy, chit chat. Those are women ones. And then the men, there were no corresponding vocabulary for to disparage men's conversation. So although I think we see some now. And then there are and this is one of my favorites. By one count, there are 22 gender-related words to label men who are sexually loose. Playboy, stud, rake, gigolo, player, Don Juan, etc. Right? You see them in the textbook on page 459. Y'all are going to go look those up, I know. But then there are over 200 words to describe women who are sexually loose. It's like, oh, okay, so it's not okay for women. We have all these derogatory terms for it, whereas men, we've only got 22. So that's probably changed since this theory came about. Another thing is, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, that men are seen as the gatekeepers of communication. Editors, directors, all those kinds of things, and that is changing in society. Right, and we do see that we see more and more women that are becoming the gatekeepers of communication. In some of the places that we see some of the more masculine roles changing, and they have been in control, is in online education. All right, is one place where we see some of the changes there. Blogs, wikis, any social media. All right. And so what we're seeing is a shift in that. They talk about a second shift and a third shift. I would say we're probably all the way down to the fifth or sixth shift that we're seeing those things change, that it's becoming more and more an androgynous voice as opposed to a more masculine voice. Translation isn't always an issue. What do you mean when you're saying that? If we're in a more masculine communication society, we have to translate what we're saying, or it has to be translated for us. What do you mean by that? I have a colleague that does that. I can't say it too loud because everybody's around today. I'm usually taping on Sunday morning when nobody's around. I have a colleague that, I'll say something and invariably he will say, well, I don't know what you mean by that. It's like, I'm not going to explain it. It's like, think about it. So anyway, we get some of that, that whole problem of translation between the two sexes or the two approaches to communication. So this is a chapter that talks some about sexual harassment and how sexual harassment wasn't even thought of 30, 40 years ago as a term. And now it is. And it's not just quid pro quo sexual favors for something positive, like grades or something like that. This is more, includes things such as hostile environment, where if you make it uncomfortable for me to work because of my sex or my gender or any of those things, then what we have is a failure to communicate, clearly. But what we have with that is a hostile environment, which makes it an environment that's hostile for me to be in. So how do muted groups become the dominant group? Well, by speaking up, by understanding what's going on, by assimilating into the dominant culture so that you become a more dominant voice, by using the accommodation theory, which some of y'all have read some articles about and have used that as examples in your tests. Anyway, the chapter ends with one thing. Do men mean to mute? Some do, some don't. Do women mean to mute? Some do, some don't. So my critique of this chapter is that it's too dated of a theory and that we need someone to come up with a better theory, or to change the muted group theory to include more than just men and women. All right, that's my personal opinion. So anyway, that's chapter 36. Chapter 37 is a summary, and there's not a PowerPoint on it. There's a handout that I've put up there, and the reason I did it that way is so that you would keep that, open that, keep that, because that shows you the ways that we use the different theories, common threads in comm theories it's called. So what theories fit where? All right. So motivation, communication, motivation to communicate, expectations, self-image, audience adaptation. All of these things that we have talked about all semester long can be applied to actual areas of communication, like narrative, all right, like social construction, like shared meanings, all right, like in conflict. So anyway, so if you'll open that and look at that, you'll see how you can take all these theories we've just spent 8 weeks talking about and apply them to different areas of your communication life. So anyway, that's the textbook. I want to remind you, you have a test due tomorrow night, Tuesday night at midnight. You have your final article analysis due on Wednesday. I have finished grading all of them now, of the articles number 2. I'm going to start grading test number 3 this evening, so I should have that to you fairly soon. I'm not going to make any guarantees the way it's been lately, and as some of y'all know, you answer way too much on test questions, so that it takes me a while with the tests. And then as soon as I am able to, I will post your grades. It'll be a while. It'll be at least a week after the end, all right? If not 10 days. And, but I'll try to keep up with you with where I stand on it. I can't apologize enough for being so far behind, but you just have seen some administrative decisions that were made without our you've just been through, and I'm sure Mrs. Foreman has mentioned it too. They increased the size of the cohort, which increased the size. In our case, there are 10 more people than have been in the cohorts up until now, and so it has increased the amount of grading that has to be done if there's going to be any rigor, you know, and we don't just hand out degrees with no rigor. So anyway, please be patient with me. I have enjoyed having you all in class. Y'all are great discussers. I love reading your stuff, even if it takes me a while, all right, to grade it. That's all right, because I've enjoyed it. All right, but I would just ask for your patience with me. I do hope to see you again sometime soon. Won't be next semester. I'm not teaching online next semester. Maybe next year, but we will see. And I hope everybody sticks with the program, goes all the way through, and gets a degree, because it'll be worth it in the end. So y'all have a great rest of the semester, and that your second half of your classes, I hope they go great. Bye.